Holding exactly $25,000 in liquid fiat currency is not a safety net. It is a calculated mathematical failure. The capital is bleeding. It sits in a state of severe static friction. This is the systemic liquidity trap. The systemic liquidity trap is a highly specific mechanical allocation archetype. It occurs when a capital mass is large enough to trigger a psychological sense of security, yet mathematically too small to generate sufficient kinetic yield. The allocator assumes the position is stable. The data suggests the position is actively decaying. Capital must be treated as a physical mass subject to the laws of entropy. When $25,000 is stored as static liquidity, it lacks directional velocity. It is acted upon by external forces rather than acting upon the market. To understand the severity of this structural flaw, we must perform a forensic audit of a standard 30-day cycle. This audit exposes the invisible mechanical drain acting on the stagnant capital. Day 1 commences with the principal sum of $25,000. It is sitting in a standard, highly accessible checking or low-yield savings account. The allocator perceives the sum as a fixed, immutable measurement. This is a cognitive error. The measurement is purely nominal. The real value of this mass is subjected to immediate, continuous atmospheric pressure from the moment it is deposited. This pressure is inflation. It is the systemic algorithmic expansion of the total currency supply. It acts as a corrosive agent on static mass. By day 5, the numbers on the screen have not changed, but the purchasing parity of those numbers has already contracted. The capital mass is shrinking in real time, even while the ledger remains visually identical. The allocator feels a sense of accomplishment looking at the screen. The mathematics of the market are simultaneously penalizing them for their inaction. By day 10, the $25,000 has not moved. It has generated zero forward momentum. However, the cost of baseline goods, energy, and localized services has subtly shifted upward. The $25,000 can now purchase precisely what $24,980 could purchase a month prior. The decay is microscopic on a daily time frame, which is exactly why it successfully bypasses the human brain's threat detection systems. By day 15, the static friction reaches its absolute peak. The capital is completely inert. It requires manual physical labor from the allocator to add even a single dollar to the pile. The money itself is performing zero labor. In a high-functioning mechanical allocation archetype, capital works autonomously. In the systemic liquidity trap, the capital is on strike. By day 20, the fractional yield from the standard financial institution registers on the ledger. It is a microscopic addition, perhaps a few dollars and cents. The allocator's brain registers this as a gain. A forensic mathematical analysis reveals it to be a rounding error. The yield does not even cover a fraction of the atmospheric drag coefficient applied by inflation. By day 25, the psychological damage of the trap begins to manifest. Because the mass is highly liquid and highly visible, it exerts a gravitational pull on the allocator's decision-making. It looks like surplus. It feels like excess capacity. The brain begins to categorize fractions of this $25,000 as available for immediate depreciating consumption. By day 30, the cycle concludes. The bank ledger displays the original numerical value of $25,000 plus the microscopic fractional yield. The allocator feels secure. They have protected their capital. They have survived the month without drawing down the principal. A forensic analysis reveals a distinctly different reality. The allocator has experienced a net negative return in absolute purchasing power. The capital has been taxed by the environment. It has been taxed by the monetary supply. It has been taxed by its own inertia. While the allocator's $25,000 decays in a static pool, the financial institution holding it is not treating it as static. The bank immediately applies kinetic velocity to the mass. They lend it out at a premium. They deploy it into yielding assets. They use the allocator's stagnant mass to generate compounding heat for their own balance sheet. The bank understands the laws of kinetic capital. The allocator does not. The allocator has effectively loaned their mass to a highly efficient machine for a return approaching zero, while assuming all the systemic risk of inflation. The $25,000 is not resting. It is working. It is simply working for someone else. The liquidity trap is now fully engaged. The money drains mechanically. The system requires zero user input to fail. The failure is entirely automated. The allocator will repeat this 30-day cycle 12 times a year. Each cycle compounds the decay. Over a 60-month timeline, the $25,000 mass will lose a significant percentage of its structural integrity, all while the digital display continues to assure the allocator that they are safe. This is the definition of a systemic failure. The trap is set not by malicious actors, but by the immutable laws of financial physics interacting with flawed human psychology. The human brain is mathematically flawed. It calculates safety in absolute static numbers. It ignores the mechanics of velocity. The number $25,000 triggers a specific neurological response. It represents a 5-figure sum. To the average allocator, this mass covers approximately 6 months of baseline operational costs. The brain categorizes this as a fortified perimeter. The data suggests this is a cognitive illusion. A static defense is not a defense. It is merely a delayed surrender. This illusion is rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of structural engineering. A bridge is not safe simply because it is heavy. It is safe because its weight is distributed to counteract active kinetic forces. The $25,000 liquid mass is not distributing force. It is merely sitting on the bridge, adding dead weight to the structure. The safety net metaphor is inherently dangerous. A net catches falling objects. It assumes the allocator is already in a state of failure. It assumes a state of free fall. Allocating capital with the primary objective of catching a fall ensures the capital will never achieve an upward trajectory. The mass is mathematically programmed for a defensive crouch. The psychological anesthesia provided by the $25,000 mass is its most lethal characteristic. Biological pain is a necessary warning system. Financial anxiety is the economic equivalent of pain. It signals that the current allocation archetype is structurally deficient. It forces the organism to hunt for yield. It forces the engineering of new kinetic cash flow. The $25,000 liquid sum silences the alarm. It functions as a localized economic anesthetic. The allocator looks at the digital ledger. The optic nerve transmits the 5-figure sum. The anxiety dissipates. The organism stops hunting. The engineering ceases. The allocator becomes complacent within the perimeter of their static defense. This complacency is catastrophic. The wider economic environment is entirely dynamic. The monetary supply is constantly expanding. Yields are actively compounding for the institutional capital owners. The allocator holding the static $25,000 is standing perfectly still on a treadmill that is slowly accelerating backwards. Because the anesthetic has numbed their financial pain receptors, they do not notice they are losing ground until the mass is severely depleted. This brings us to the mechanics of high-velocity lifestyle inflation. Liquidity eliminates structural friction. This is its primary hazard. When capital is highly liquid, the barrier to deployment is a plastic card or a biometric scan. The physical friction coefficient approaches zero. The brain assesses the $25,000 mass. A consumer upgrade presents itself. A minor luxury, a premium hardware purchase. The cost is $500. The brain performs a rapid calculation. $500 is precisely 2% of the total liquid mass. The mind categorizes this fraction as mathematically insignificant. The extraction is authorized. This process repeats. The baseline cost of existing creeps upward. The allocator upgrades their transport tier. They upgrade their caloric consumption tier. They upgrade their subscription architectures. The $25,000 acts as a psychological buffer, authorizing these upgrades because the mass appears large enough to absorb the shock. The allocator does not perceive the danger. They still possess a 5-figure sum. But the structural dynamics have violently shifted. The monthly maintenance tax has increased. The $25,000 now covers 4 months of baseline costs rather than the original 6. The mass is not moved, but the gravity of the allocator's lifestyle has increased. The trap tightens. Liquidity becomes a liability precisely when it lacks a designated vector. Capital must have directional velocity. Mass without directional velocity is chaotic. It pools. It stagnates. Water in a moving river generates hydroelectric power. Water in a stagnant pool generates parasites. Liquid capital operates on the exact same physical laws. When $25,000 sits in a highly accessible state without a dedicated structural assignment, it is unarmored mass operating in a hostile environment. It is targeted by algorithmic marketing. It is targeted by systemic peer emulation. It is targeted by the allocator's own internal desire for immediate dopamine synthesis. The broader financial system relies on this exact behavioral failure. The architecture of modern consumerism is precision engineered to locate and extract unassigned liquidity. It detects the stagnant pool. It installs a drain. The allocator believes the $25,000 is an asset on their personal balance sheet. A forensic review reveals it is an asset on the wider economic balance sheet. The broader economy is simply waiting for the allocator to voluntarily deploy it into depreciating liabilities. The liquidity ensures the extraction will be seamless. To defend the mass, the allocator must manually resist every single extraction attempt. They must deploy human willpower. The data suggests willpower is a highly finite resource. It suffers from acute decision fatigue. A system that relies on manual willpower to protect liquid capital will mathematically fail over an extended timeline. The safety net is an illusion designed to keep the capital stagnant until it is consumed. Capital operates strictly under Newtonian principles. It is not an abstract concept. It is a physical mass. When mass is at rest, it requires immense external force to achieve motion. This is the law of static friction. $25,000 sitting in a high-yield savings account or a checking ledger is mass completely at rest. To move this mass, to increase it, the allocator must exert severe manual force. This force is derived entirely from active labor. It requires the direct conversion of biological time and physical energy into fiat currency. Overcoming static friction is the most energy-intensive phase of any mechanical operation. The allocator is constantly pushing a heavy object from a dead zero-velocity stop. Every single month, the pushing must begin again. The system provides zero mechanical assist. There is no flywheel. There is no momentum. If the allocator ceases their manual labor, the mass instantly stops growing. In fact, due to the atmospheric drag of inflation, the mass immediately begins sliding backward. The allocator is trapped in a perpetual state of static friction. They are the sole engine for the capital. The capital is not an engine for them. Kinetic friction, conversely, is the resistance encountered by an object that is already in motion. Overcoming kinetic friction requires exponentially less energy than breaking static friction. A high capital allocator possesses kinetic mass. Their capital is already deployed. It is already moving. The ambient momentum of the market carries the mass forward. They do not need to push from a dead stop. They simply steer the moving mass. The $25,000 liquid trap denies the allocator this mechanical advantage. Mass dictates heat generation. We must look to astrophysics to understand capital yield. A massive stellar body, a sun, generates immense internal heat through sheer gravitational pressure. This pressure forces atoms together, leading to nuclear fusion. The body becomes a star. It generates its own energy. It radiates heat. It is entirely self-sustaining. A small asteroid operates in the same vacuum but generates nothing. It lacks the critical mass required to trigger internal fusion. It is a cold, dead rock. The $25,000 liquid sum is the asteroid. It lacks the critical mass required to generate its own kinetic heat. Consider the yield, a fraction of a percent, perhaps a few $100s over a 12-month cycle. This is not fusion. This is ambient temperature. The fractional interest it yields cannot trigger the chain reaction of compound interest. The heat dissipates into the vacuum faster than it is created. The mass remains cold. It cannot sustain the allocator. Instead, the allocator must constantly sustain the mass with fresh injections of active labor just to prevent it from freezing entirely. Consider the architecture of a massive industrial engine. The engine represents the broader kinetic financial market. The $25,000 liquid sum is a gear. It is a heavy, perfectly machined component. It has utility, but it is completely disconnected from the primary drive shaft. It sits isolated on a sterile workbench. It does not turn. It does not transfer energy. The allocator can approach the workbench and spin the gear by hand. It moves freely, but it drives no pistons. It turns no axles. It produces no measurable output. Stagnant cash is the inert gear. The allocator looks at the workbench and believes they possess a machine. They do not. They possess a spare part. Until that gear is lifted from the workbench and mechanically installed into the active engine of the market, it remains an isolated, useless component. Furthermore, a gear that does not turn does not distribute lubrication. It sits exposed to the elements. It slowly accumulates the rust of inflation. The teeth of the gear, its purchasing power, quietly corrode. The universe does not tolerate absolute stagnation. Entropy is an absolute law. If a mass is not generating kinetic heat, it is freezing. If the gear is not turning, it is seizing. The $25,000 is not resting in a safe harbor. It is in a state of active, silent decay. Safety is not found in stillness. In the physics of capital, safety is only found in velocity. The static mass is not merely decaying due to inflation. It is under active, continuous assault. Two relentless, automated forces attack the inert capital. The first is the maintenance tax. The second is the attention drain. The maintenance tax is the absolute baseline operational cost of existing within the modern economic framework. It is the cost of biological and structural survival. Shelter algorithms, caloric logistics, energy grid access, telecommunication routing. This tax is levied relentlessly, month after month. The market does not care about the allocator's fatigue. The market only demands its extraction. In a standard configuration, the allocator relies on active labor to offset this extraction. The active income acts as a kinetic shield, covering the maintenance tax. The $25,000 sits quietly behind this shield. But the system is structurally fragile. It possesses a single point of failure. If the active labor input ceases due to biological malfunction or corporate redundancy, the shield drops. When the shield drops, the maintenance tax immediately targets the static mass. The $25,000 must now absorb the full kinetic impact of the allocator's existence. Because the mass is small and generates no internal yield, it is forced to consume itself. The system cannibalizes its own architecture. Every month of survival requires the amputation of a percentage of the total mass. The safety net functions by slowly digesting the allocator's past labor. The $25,000 is not insurance. It is a finite countdown timer. The second antagonist is more insidious. It is the attention drain. Capital allocation is, at its core, a cognitive function. The human brain possesses a finite amount of random access memory. Strategic engineering requires massive allocations of this cognitive RAM. Building wealth requires deep focus on systemic architecture. The allocator holding the $25,000 trap is forced to run constant low-level background processes. They monitor the ledger. They track microtransactions. They perform daily risk calculations on minor consumer variables. The $25,000 is large enough to require defense, but mathematically too small to defend itself. This state of hypervigilance is a severe misallocation of cognitive bandwidth. The brain is dedicating high-tier processing power to low-tier maintenance tasks. The allocator is constantly looking down at the safety net. They are structurally unable to look up to engineer kinetic systems. The small sum monopolizes their focus. The opportunity cost of this attention drain is mathematically staggering. You cannot build a skyscraper while staring anxiously at the foundation. The $25,000 demands attention, yet yields no return on that cognitive investment. To fully expose this vulnerability, we must run a mechanical stress test. We introduce a sudden unprogrammed variable into the system, a $5,000 systemic failure. The data suggests these variables are a mathematical certainty over a long enough timeline, a localized biological malfunction requiring medical capital, a critical structural failure in a primary transport vehicle, an environmental breach in a housing unit. Observe the low capital allocator caught in the systemic liquidity trap. They hold the $25,000 static mass. The $5,000 event strikes. The impact is direct and kinetic. It immediately vaporizes exactly 20% of their total capital architecture. The structural damage is severe. The psychological shock is paralyzing. The allocator's brain registers a catastrophic breach of the perimeter. The organism assumes a defensive crouch. All forward progress is halted. Every ounce of active labor is redirected to repair the 20% breach. The system destabilizes. The allocator loses months, potentially years, of kinetic momentum merely to rebuild a static wall. Now contrast this stress test with a high capital allocator. Their mass is not static, it is entirely kinetic. It is deployed across broad market index funds and yield-bearing mechanical assets. The exact same $5,000 variable strikes. The mass is hit, but the impact is absorbed entirely by the ambient kinetic yield of the larger moving mass. The $5,000 extraction is a fraction of the system's annual automated output. The core principle does not register the impact. The machine shutters, recalibrates, and continues to operate without human intervention. The high capital allocator does not halt forward progress. They do not assume a defensive crouch. They do not reallocate cognitive RAM to manage the crisis. The system handles the variable autonomously. The emergency is downgraded to a routine operational expense. The difference between these two outcomes is not superior intellect. It is not moral fortitude. It is not a higher pain tolerance. The difference is purely mechanical architecture. The low capital allocator relied on a static wall. The high capital allocator built a kinetic engine. The $25,000 trap guarantees that every moderate variable will be experienced as a systemic crisis. The math dictates the panic. To escape the systemic liquidity trap, the allocator must completely abandon the concept of a static safety net. The defensive crouch must end. The capital must be weaponized. The allocator must implement the optionality protocol. The foundation of this protocol is a strict mathematical metric known as the optionality index. The optionality index is not a measure of net worth. Net worth is a vanity metric. It often includes illiquid liabilities masquerading as assets. The optionality index measures only one thing: mechanical freedom. The formula is precise. It is the ratio of passive kinetic yield divided by the baseline maintenance tax. If the kinetic yield generated by a capital mass completely covers the maintenance tax, the optionality index is exactly 1.0. At a score of 1.0, the allocator has achieved absolute mechanical autonomy. Active labor is no longer a requirement for biological or structural survival. If the yield is less than the tax, the index is a fraction. A score of 0.2 means the machine covers 20% of existence. Active labor must supply the remaining 80. A liquid mass of $25,000, decaying in a standard checking ledger, produces an optionality index approaching absolute zero. It generates no kinetic yield. It provides zero optionality. It merely delays the inevitable consumption of the principal. To elevate the optionality index, the allocator must build the automated defensive moat. This requires the immediate transition of the $25,000 from static liquidity to kinetic capital. This is a three-step engineering process. Step 1 is the calculation of the operational buffer. This is a semantic and psychological recalibration. The allocator must stop viewing the cash as an emergency fund. It is an operational buffer. It is the absolute minimum fiat currency required to facilitate 90 days of the baseline maintenance tax. Calculate the exact cost of 90 days of survival. If that number is $10,000, then $10,000 is the hard cap for the liquid mass. Do not add a single dollar beyond the cap. The allocator must accept that this $10,000 will suffer from the atmospheric drag of inflation. It will generate a negative real yield. The allocator must accept this decay as the explicit insurance premium required to maintain immediate liquidity. Step 2 is the kinetic transition. The operational buffer is capped at $10,000. The remaining $15,000 is excess mass. It is a seized gear. It must be forcefully ejected from the stagnant pool. It must be routed directly into the active engine of the market. This mass must be deployed into highly efficient yield-bearing mechanical vehicles. Broad market index funds. Dividend-producing equity architectures. Assets that possess inherent forward velocity. The $15,000 is no longer a buffer. It is now a working component. It is absorbing the kinetic heat of the broader economy. It is compounding. It is mathematically aligning with the expansion of the monetary supply rather than fighting it. Step 3 is the algorithmic override. The transition from static to kinetic cannot rely on human intervention. The data suggests human motivation is a rapidly depreciating asset. It fatigues. Discipline fractures under operational stress. Emotional variables corrupt logical deployment. The routing of capital must be executed by unfeeling algorithms. The allocator must engineer the system to bypass human psychology entirely. Set the transfer protocols at the institutional level. The moment active labor income enters the primary ledger, the algorithmic routing must engage. The system must immediately verify the operational buffer. If the buffer is at capacity, the algorithm automatically sweeps all excess mass into the kinetic index vehicles. This must happen before the allocator has the opportunity to visually process the funds. If the optic nerve registers the excess liquidity, the brain will attempt to authorize a depreciating consumer upgrade. The algorithm prevents the visual confirmation. It removes human emotion from the chain of command. The capital is now in motion. The static friction is broken. Kinetic momentum has been established. The $25,000 trap has been systematically dismantled. The allocator has transitioned from a biological laborer defending a shrinking pile of fiat to a mechanical engineer operating a kinetic machine. This is the ultimate asymmetric advantage. Mechanical engineering always defeats human motivation over a long enough timeline. Motivation requires constant caloric and emotional energy. Systems execute flawlessly in the dark. Systems do not tire. Systems do not experience financial anxiety. Stop relying on the illusion of the safety net. Stop hoarding static mass. Calculate the operational buffer. Deploy the excess. Automate the routing. Build the machine. Let the machine run.